You know, for a guy who said he was done talking about trans people, Dave Chappelle sure loves to talk a lot about trans people, doesn't he? Hello interwebs, I hope you're all doing well. I want to take today's video to do a quick chat about offensive comedy, especially as it relates to comments that I constantly see directed at trans people like me surrounding recent trans-centered jokes by the likes of Dave Chappelle and Ricky Gervais. Comedians who are well known for their offensive comedy style of making fun of everybody and offending everybody in equal measure. And the comments that I want to focus on are these, let's just call them criticisms, that I continually get about how I need to have a thicker skin as a trans person. I mean, why do trans people have to be so sensitive? You lefty liberals are always getting so easily triggered, is the common nice way of how I see this criticism often wielded at me and other trans people when talking about Dave Chappelle and Ricky Gervais and other offensive transgender-centered comedy. I always find criticism like this both laughable and incredibly frustrating. And the reason I find it laughable is because it's funny to me that there are people out there who think that trans people, especially publicly facing trans people and trans people who are known to be out, somehow have a very thin skin for transgender-centered jokes or comedy or even insults hurled at us. Trans people every day going through our lives constantly face so much hate and harassment and bullshit just for existing. Even in trans-friendly areas, I constantly have to deal with tension whenever I go out and having to see, is this place gonna be friendly to me being trans? And online, literally just look at my comments. They are literally littered with hate comments that I have to go through, look at, and filter out all the dang time. And for the most part, I have developed quite a thick skin for those types of comments, mostly because the types of comments that I get are usually the same 5 or 6 things regurgitated over and over again. Like, oh, when they dig up your bones in 1,000 years, they'll know that you are a boy or a girl, or, oh, look, you look like a man, I can definitely tell you're Adam's apple. Like those types of things that I just get over and over and over again to the point where I'm just inured to it. Now, that being said, there are some trans people, especially younger trans people or trans people who are still coming out, who haven't developed a thick skin to those comments, and it is incredibly harmful to their mental health, as it was for me as I was coming out. And honestly, it is very angering to me that any trans person has to develop a thick skin for that consistent level of harassment that always exists, and depending on your level of visibility, will constantly just get the dial turned up more and more on it. But that being said, it is something that most trans people have developed a sort of layer of inurement to. So I find it laughable when people say, oh, you're always so triggered and upset by this type of comedy. But this ultimately is where my frustration element of this comes in, because the reason I have frustration is that I know the reason that people constantly say, oh, you're always so triggered by these comments, is that they find this comedy about trans people funny. And when trans people point out the fact that we don't find it funny, they don't wish to listen to us and just want to chalk it off as us being offended. When in actuality, we're explaining why this humor is not offensive to us, but just lazily regurgitating pre-existing biases against trans people that don't actually speak to the truth of a trans experience, the same biases that underscore the consistent attacks we are seeing against the trans community right now in things like the ongoing assault of anti-trans legislation in the United States and UK that we are seeing. And normally I understand this ethos of I think a comedian should be able to tell jokes about anything. I don't really feel like, for the most part, there's anything that is off limits for a comedian to joke about. I think really anything is open, even some of the most horrendous stuff that you can think of. But the caveat there is that humor needs to come from a place of being able to understand the depth of where that humor is coming from. The reason that Dave Chappelle garnered such a great reputation as a comedian, and I think deservedly so, is because so much of his humor came out of understanding what his experience was as a black man living in America, and also poking fun at the blind spots and biases and even racism of white people. Like, his offense is trying to push the boundaries of what we would normally consider taboo to talk about, and poking fun at it and allowing us to talk about it in an open way, but also directing very clearly the target of his ire at the people in power in that situation. You know, making fun of the racial dynamics and white people that perpetuate these things, while also still poking fun at his own community as well. So much so that, I've spoken about this, that he quit the Chappelle Show because he found that a lot of his comedy was allowing white people to get too comfortable with laughing at things that he didn't think that white people should be comfortable with. And then him coming back, years later with much more targeted humor at understanding that dynamic. But when he goes to trans humor, he clearly does not come from a place of understanding the trans experience. And so a lot of his jokes come from this place of just regurgitating misinformation about a trans experience. An example that Kat Black said in her recent video centered around like how a lot of conservative jokes, and the Daily Wire did this too in their recent Lady Ballers movie, center around this idea of like, oh, people are becoming trans women to win at sports or just quickly get surgeries. They're handed out like candy or whatever. When in actuality, like trans people have to go through a lot of bullshit and bureaucracy to be able to get surgeries. So when, trans people hear that joke, of like, oh, look, it's going on candy. It's just like, no, that's actually a joke that is usually, that is centered around this presupposition that trans people are easily able to get surgeries. That is what is often used to push anti-trans laws from people like trans people being able to get access to medical care that supports us. So that humor is actually building up and reinforcing this belief that ultimately is bolstering the ongoing targeting of the trans community. So it's not that I or many trans people find that humor particularly offensive. It's more just the humor isn't speaking to anything, number one, real within a trans experience, and number two, is reinforcing biases in people that already exist within our culture that is already harming our marginalized community. The way that offensive humor works, as I said before, is when it is trying to target things that are taboo that we don't want to talk about in our society, that poke fun at things that we don't want to look at but need to be said. And comedy and humor is often a really radical way that you can be able to say those things in a place that you normally wouldn't be able to. It's, again, poking fun at the powerful and poking fun at the assumptions of our society that ultimately reinforce bigotries. I think offensive comedy can and should work, but it needs to be very pointedly targeted and thought out. Whereas, honestly, I find the work of Dave Chappelle lately, especially as it relates to trans people, and even more especially the folks like Ricky Gervais, to be incredibly lazy. It's neither of them interrogating what it means to be trans, a trans experience, like really doing their research when coming up with these jokes, and just sort of lazily regurgitating the status quo's biases against trans people. And it really just comes across as just bad. And it really just showcases their laziness, especially in the case of Ricky Gervais, who has generally been a very mean-spirited, kind of lazy comedian overall. But even then had moments of speaking to power and speaking to, targeting people who need to be targeted, but over the years has just gotten more and more lazy with his humor. And the reason that they do this, especially I think in Ricky Gervais's case, but I even think so too with Dave Chappelle, is the economic incentive to do so. It's very clear when you do this sort of like offensive comedy that gets trans people and the left all riled up, is that then you can say, oh, look, they're canceling me, come see my show, come see the thing that they don't want you to see, buy my tickets to this thing. They can sort of play that cancel culture narrative in order to, get attention. And it speaks to like, oh, you want to court attention rather than actually make meaningful art, which is really deeply depressing. It also goes to another conversation around like where a certain type of humor is appropriate and whose humor it is for, because I do think that there is a place where you can make comedy that would offend a lot of trans people. I've been to comedy shows by trans comedians who make some really insightful and yet jokes that make me slightly uncomfortable. I think there is a place for that type of comedy, but usually that is more for comedy that is like within the group of trans people or within a community that is more understanding of these issues. I think there are some really wonderful comedians that can do that work of like really getting vulnerable with their work and vulnerable with their thought process and also empathetic with working with other people to create comedy that really builds up a concise thesis. Because that's the other thing too that people don't really think about, especially if you look at something like The Closer. Like good comedy specials, I think the best comedy specials are kind of like video essays, just related to myself, but are really making a point. I mean, look at someone like George Carlin. George Carlin's comedy was very much like making an argument in every one of his specials. He was very funny, but they all had like a very clear point. You know, I always find comedy where it's just like random joke with no real through line through them to be all that funny. Like, yeah, I'll laugh at a joke here and there, but I think a really good comedy special has an ultimate through line that underlies the entire story. I think, for example, one of my favorite comedians is Mike Birbiglia, who does these really wonderful jobs of like telling a looping story that sets up some like a tale at the beginning, goes through and like brings you through all the things that led to that moment, and then ends with that story again, and it being like this weird revealing of his vulnerabilities and anxieties that led to that moment. Like Sleepwalk With Me, I think, did a really good job with that. And I think when you look at something like The Closer, his ultimate point, like in that comedy special, was like, fuck trans people. And when you see him coming up with things like The Dreamer, his references to trans people are clearly there to like stoke controversy again, to bring attention to the special, without really being pertinent to anything that he's talking about within that special at the time. And so it just showcases how just hackneyed and very superficial his engagement with those stories are. And I will at least give him the credit to say at least he's making some argument, even if it is, I think, a not very good one or a very insightful one, as opposed to someone like Ricky Gervais, who is just saying random offensive comedy just to get attention. It's really lazy. And this is also why something like South Park is very hit or miss for me, because South Park also does that offensive comedy, and at times can hit really, 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 really hard. But because it is a show that doesn't really have a clear overriding ethos behind it, and just willy-nilly attacks everybody, a lot of the times its target of its humor can just be reinforcing the status quo. I mean, I think of that episode of South Park where they were like, oh, look at this man who went and joined women's sports to win women's sports. That whole episode, bullshit nonsense. Which is just disappointing, because when South Park hits, as it actually kind of did decently well with its recent Kathleen Kennedy episode, I think that it can actually be very hard-hitting, but just the lack of real clear driving force in terms of the thinking behind that show, I think ultimately just leaves it like not as powerful as it could be in a lot of its statements. Than if Matt and Trey actually had a backbone in what they wanted to say about stuff, instead of having this cynical, I don't give a shit about anything early 2000s sort of vibe to them. So ultimately, that idea of like, oh, you are so offended, why just get over it, stop being so triggered comment, frustrates me, because it's like, I'm not offended, I'm more just disappointed, I guess, to play like the I'm a disappointed dad, more just sad, because it's like, you could be so much better. And so I'm not offended by this comedy. I'm not sitting here and being like, oh, I'm so hurt. It's more just like, I'm more offended by the laziness of the joke, and more perturbed by the fact that you're just continuing to normalize bigotries that harm a marginalized group, instead of using that platform and your clear skill to be able to say something more meaningful, and just trying to get more money and coast off of your reputation that you rightfully had earned, but are no longer willing to try to uphold with meaningful art. And, you know, I am sounding very, you know, complimentary of Dave Chappelle, and I want to be very clear, fuck that man. He's very clear about, like, his laziness at this point. So I'm not, like, trying to be like, oh, look, Dave Chappelle is really wonderful and he could just be better or whatever. I'm more just saying, like, it's such an interesting thing to look at Dave Chappelle, to just see the path that he has walked towards becoming this more cynical, economically mainstream focused comedian than someone who wishes to make art that actually speaks to something meaningful. So where I want to end this on is, when we talk about offensive comedy, I just charge people to really question where that comedy is being targeted, because I do think there is always a place for offensive comedy, but where I think the line between whether it's good or bad comes from is where that offense is coming from, and who is it really there for, and who are we offending? The people who need to be offended, or the people who are already being harmed?